Decisive battles are a crucial part of human history, and I feel like as a fantasy world builder, as a fantasy writer, it's prudent that you feature decisive battles between the various factions and nations of your world. This is going to be a case study of this idea, as we're going to look at an underrated decisive battle, the Battle of Bouvines. My name is Peter Capozzi, I'm the author of the God Shard series, and welcome to Peter's No Cap History, the show where I combine my loves of history and fantasy to provide potential points of inspiration for aspiring fantasy artists, writers, and world builders. So let me set the stage for this. Because the Battle of Bouvines is the culmination of a lesser war between Philip Augustin of France and basically half of Western Europe, including King John of England, and this is the same King John that was famously an enemy of Robin Hood. There's also Otto IV of the Holy Roman Empire, as well as the Dukes of Brabant, Holland, Flanders, Lorraine, and Limburg. Now, King Philip II of France wasn't alone. He also had the Count of Dreux and the Duke of Burgundy on his side, but still. So what on earth caused this conflict in the first place? Even at this point, England and France had been at odds for years, for nearly a century at this point. And there's a lot of things that have factored into this. I'm going to try and be as quick as possible. Ever since William the Conqueror, a lot of the English kings also had lands in France. And while at this point it's a different noble house than William the Conqueror's, that still was absolutely a thing. This was the House of Plantagenet, which includes the likes of Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. A few decades before this battle took place, the English had a lot of land in France, because a lot of the English kings also held titles in various places in France. There were the Dukes of Normandy, the Dukes of Aquitaine. The House of Plantagenet started out as the Counts of Anjou, again, a city in France, not England. And indeed, in the English courts at this time, they were speaking French, not English. Basically, you had the French kings trying to, assert their will over these French houses. But the thing is, one of these houses was now the King of England. This is quite a substantial holding here. This is a good chunk of France as well as England. That is quite a lot of land, and most of it was lost due to the efforts of King Philip II. Philip II Augustus was a major rival of literally 3 generations of English kings: Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and John Lackland. He had conflicts and wars with all 3 of them, and the one he had the most success with was King John. Philip II had a lot of work cut out to him, because France at this time was not this nation. Seriously, you had a lot of influences from all these other areas. Seriously, southern France had its own subculture known as L'Occitan. Lorraine and Burgundy had a lot of independence. The French also clashed with Flanders and Brabant and many of these areas in the Netherlands and Dutch. So you had all these competing influences that could hold their own against the French trying to assert their influence on it, while King Philip was trying to extend it outward. So basically the purpose of this grand coalition was trying to restore the losses of King John. Now, King John was actually not involved in Bouvines. He was further south at the time. He actually had retreated back to Bordeaux, because to be honest, King John was not that competent. Another crucial thing to note is King Philip also had the support of the Pope, because Otto IV of the Holy Roman Empire and King John were both excommunicated. And for the Holy Roman Empire, we'll get back to that later, but this is just during a very brief time when the House of Wealth, aka the house where Otto IV was from, was the Holy Roman Emperor. So let's get to the actual battle. Now, the battle itself is very interesting because it's actually not that remarkable. There wasn't like an ace in the hole that one side did that gave him the edge. This isn't like Agincourt, where longbowmen proved to be decisive against French knights. It was a very close battle that could have gone either way. And while King Philip was outnumbered, it wasn't like by a ton necessarily. Essentially, the battle was basically just a back and forth between the French knights and soldiers and all the other knights and soldiers. And ultimately, the French just proved to be just that ever so slightly better. And the thing is, again, it kept switching between who was about to win. And there were quite a few times when some of the various nobles and leaders at the battle were nearly killed. The Count of Flanders and the Duke of Burgundy both had their horses killed and were this close to dying. Otto IV was nearly taken down, and it took the sacrifice of his knights that made him get away. Even King Philip II, he was pulled off his horse by some hooked pikes. Now, I've read different accounts on what saved him. One was simply the fact that he had good armor, but another one is that one of his French knights basically sacrificed himself. It was down to the wire, but the point is the French won. And this had huge repercussions. It basically was crucial for establishing France as a nation so that it wouldn't get absorbed by all these other competing influences so easily, and ensure that King John would never regain those lands that they had lost. I mean, King John was already not well liked at this point because this war ended in a French victory. It weakened King John's position so much that he had to sign the Magna Carta. Yes, seriously, this ties into the Magna Carta. And while the influence in the Magna Carta is often exaggerated, it still had an influence on common law, and it was the first stepping stone that established the idea of a king not being above the law. Which is funny because it did the exact opposite for France, which would legitimize the French monarchy, which would be a thing up until the French Revolution. You had similar legitimacy issues with Otto IV, and this made Otto IV's position so weak that he was deposed and replaced by Frederick II, who was supported by the Pope, and who was also part of the House of Hohenstaufen, aka the German house that also would take over Sicily. So basically now the kings of Sicily were now the Holy Roman Emperors. If you saw my Sicily video, you would see how that would have a ripple effect. And since King Philip II had the Pope's involvement in this as well, this would also start the growing trend of the Popes calling upon the Kingdom of France as well, which again would have a ripple effect, if you've seen my Sicily video, on the Kingdom of France getting involved in the affairs of Italy. All these things can be traced back to the Battle of Bouvines. It proved crucial stepping stones for the French monarchy to establish control and dominance over France. And it caused a ripple effect that affected all these other places. You see what I mean? It's so interesting how one decisive battle can change the fate of so much. What's the takeaway of this for your own fantasy stories? I feel like this battle provides a good case study on how a lot of this works. For a decisive battle to be decisive, you need to successfully establish the history of your kingdoms and your world. What leads to a bunch of kingdoms not liking each other? What causes them to fight each other? You need to recognize that whoever wins is going to have a lot of power and say. It is very important you get all this right. Because if it doesn't add up, your world is not going to be believable. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're putting your setting together. Make sure that you have some decisive battles in there and make sure that they make sense. So that's basically it. I hope you guys liked this episode. I will see you guys later.